in brand new remastered Technicolor.
Hello. Oh, fuck's sake. Try that again. Hello, and welcome to Two Queers,
One Pod.
I'm Bridie.
I'm Imogen.
Yes, today we are filming and recording this podcast without Harry, and it all just feels a little bit up in the air, but I think we've done okay so far. We've had a couple of technical mishaps.
We are pro podcasters.
But yeah. What episode is this now? 7?
7.
Wow. That is pro, to be fair. That is pretty pro. Cool.
But we managed to do an interview for this episode, which is very exciting, and we did that all by ourselves.
Yeah, look at us go.
This will be, I suppose, about half an hour-ish of us yammering away, and then 25 minutes with our beautiful friend Phoebe.
Yes, it's definitely an honour to have Phoebe as our first guest. She's an awesome just general person and friend and all sorts, and it was really, really great to chat to her, so I'm excited to pop that in there. I'm excited to chat to her later on. But today's episode is about bodies in photography, so that's kind of representation of people in photography, both queer and otherwise, and just our kind of thoughts and feels on that topic. And yeah, so we'll have a chat about that amongst ourselves and with you guys, obviously, and then we'll jump into the interview with Phoebe a bit later on.
Cool. So when was the first time that you saw an image that you felt either was like really aspirational to you or that kind of represented you?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure it was actually that early on in life, to be honest. I think for a lot of my sort of adolescence and childhood, it was always like the people that you saw in the media were aspirations rather than on a level with you. Does that make sense? And I think that's definitely the intention, because we live in a society. But I would say it wasn't until I probably got Instagram, and even a couple of years into having Instagram, and then started to follow kind of people with like similar body type to me, that I actually felt as though, oh no, there are people that are confident in themselves that also are similar to me. Does that make sense? I think it took a long time for me to feel kind of, not like I had a place, because that's a bit too morbid, but like just that I don't know, was kind of, you didn't have to live up to this a lot of times unachievable standard in the media and in photography and stuff like this. And also because I'm also a graphic designer and I work in Photoshop quite a lot, it wasn't until I kind of learned all the ins and outs of that editing software where I really understood, like, oh my god, you can literally manipulate photos so much. So probably half the people that I was seeing photographed growing up didn't even look like that, you know? I don't know if you've seen that video. It just popped into my head of when they edit that piece. Do you know what I'm talking about? They edit that piece of pizza into like a swimwear model. And that is just kind of, that just goes to show really, doesn't it? But yeah, that wouldn't be my preferred. If I was super duper great at Photoshop, that would not be my preferred career choice. But you know, you got to make money somehow. But yeah, what about you?
Yeah, and I think when people started doing it, I suppose it's similar in the way that a lot of bad things happen, is that people in tech or science start out just kind of trying to push the envelope and seeing what they can do, and probably no one thought that would become the norm of completely changing the way we think that human bodies look. And if you think about like the live filters and beauty filters of today, where someone can look like that's how they look in sort of a video like this, There's actually a feature on Zoom that I saw the other day where you can like give yourself different makeup.
Oh,
and the
my
temptation
goodness.
for me to give myself better eyebrows was so strong.
Yeah.
But then I thought
Your eyebrows are
that's
pretty
gonna
great,
glitch
though.
and that's going to be. Thank you. This took a long time. But yeah, I remember the first time I remember seeing something in a magazine that I really wanted to look like was Agnes Dane, the model, in I think it was a Jean Paul Gaultier fragrance advert, and it was black and white, and she had platinum blonde, really like close cropped hair around the sides, and then really long on the top.
Oh, no, that's interesting.
And I was probably about 13 when I saw that. And the moment I saw that, I wanted it. I wanted that hair. And everyone told me that I would regret it, that I'd look like a dick. Every boy I was ever with at that time, because that was before I ever had relationships with anyone other than boys, was always like, absolutely not, you're not cutting your hair. Like, you're not, you know, you'd look really stupid blonde, and all of this stuff. And then cut to 2015, Christmas, exactly like 5 years ago. I dyed my hair blonde and I've never looked back.
It honestly, and it does actually really, really suit you insofar as like you, I mean, obviously I've seen photos of you where you had your kind of natural, more brown hair, but it actually doesn't, but it doesn't matter if you bleached it. But what I was saying is it really does suit you. So all those boys when you were growing up have zero taste and zero understanding.
Well, obviously they had some taste because they were with me.
Oh, of course. Oh, yeah. Sorry, that sounded so horrible.
No. I know what you meant, but yeah, I remember people being so emphatic, and about the short haircut thing, like about you know it not being feminine, and about boys not liking that and stuff. But I've always been way more confident with short hair, and I remember when I first got really into looking at like high fashion stuff, there was a spin more towards the gender bending, more androgynous thing. And I was like, oh, these are my people.
Yeah.
These are the, where you look at them and you're not sure, girl or boy, it's just art, it's just fashion. And like, obviously the fashion industry has all sorts of awful stuff going on. It is not a pinnacle of, you know, good social morals and ethics. But in this one regard, I felt like maybe there was a place for me in these spaces where that kind of more like brutal beauty was appreciated. And that was what I wanted to look like. I wanted to look stronger. I wanted to look sort of more butch, I suppose. I wanted to be more of a question mark. And that was long before I knew about gender nonconformity or non-binary people or anything like that. But I remember seeing people like that and being like, that's the aspiration to me.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, actually. Because when I was growing up, I didn't feel represented, but there was constant kind of, oh, if I look like that, that would be great. You know, there was constant kind of, I guess, inspiration that I didn't necessarily follow. But no, I definitely say, and I remember when, like, you know, Miley Cyrus cut all of her hair off and actually had kind of a similar style to what you've got now. I loved that haircut, but obviously until this year, because now I have really short hair, I never thought that I would do it. I never thought it would suit me, but it actually, I think, since doing it, it suits me more than any sort of previous look I've had, because I just feel a bit more happy in myself. And I don't know whether that was just the need to kind of, you know, cut all my hair off and start again, essentially. Could be a mix.
I think
of
it's
both.
really interesting though, because as much as obviously we have very narrow ideas of beauty and beauty standards, and they're all very Western Eurocentric, there is still an element of variety. And so growing up thinking about people that were typically seen as very, very beautiful, like I've never particularly aspired to look like Marilyn Monroe or Angelina Jolie or I don't know, other really, really beautiful people that I think are very, very beautiful, but there was no part of me that was like, I desperately wanted to look like that.
Yeah.
In the way that the people that were like Keira Knightley, Natalie Portman, there's a little bit more of the masculine in the bone structure. There's flatter chests. There's all of these things that I now look at it from a 2020 lens, and I'm like, oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't just that you thought that these people were really beautiful, because it wasn't limited to that. You know, I also think that Megan Fox is incredibly beautiful, but there's nothing that I would, or, you know, the Kim Kardashians of the world, again, really beautiful, but like not something that I would ever aspire to look like, even with all the Instagram in the world and all of these modern beauty standards of the big bum and the boobs and the lips and all of that. Like, it's never got me in that way. That the more androgynous thing has kind of like, I felt it in my gut of like, oh, that's the kind of beauty that I would want.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting because, you know, some people, you know, desperately want to look like Jennifer Aniston or Jennifer Lawrence or those sorts of people. And I think you find the people that you most want to look like, even in that narrow pool. And of course, all of these people are white, because white people are allowed to have a little bit more variety in how they look in order to hit the mainstream and in order to be that kind of A-list successful.
Yeah. I've seen a lot this week and in the last couple of weeks about, you've probably seen it too, about that recent photo shoot that Harry Styles did for was it Vogue?
Yeah, it was
to be honest, yeah. Oh, good. I don't really keep up with kind of, I know you're a lot more into kind of like high fashion than I am, because like, it's not that it doesn't interest me, it's just I just don't really pay attention. But I saw a lot of people that I follow on Instagram, kind of rightfully so, just saying, because there was the photo shoot of him dressing like androgynously, if that's a word, and in a dress and stuff, and how it was kind of taking away. It wasn't taking away necessarily, but it could be misconstrued as kind of, you know, trans people and queer people started the kind of quote unquote cross-dressing thing. But, you know, there's no it's two sides to it, actually, because I've seen some people being like annoyed about it, and other people being like, it's kind of like when Madonna did Vogue, and it kind of didn't take away, but it put it into the mainstream so that other people could then appreciate the people that started doing this.
Yeah, I think it is. That's a really good comparison to draw, because I don't think everyone was happy with Madonna doing Vogue, and I think if people are interested, then they will see what Harry Styles' Vogue cover looks like, and then we'll go, where did this start? They'll look into it, they'll realise that it's inevitably black queer people that started making that cool enough to get to a point where someone like Madonna or Harry Styles will do it.
Yeah.
He did get flack for it. Like, people went off on mad tirades about the death of men and like the masculine role model and all of this kind of stuff. But then he's also one of the few people that could get away with it and still be put on the cover of Vogue, whereas the vast majority of masculine presenting people that wear a dress would be ridiculed or physically attacked, verbally attacked, all of these things that trans and gender non-conforming people live on a daily basis. It's not just a costume that you can put on and take off at the end of the day. It's, you know, it's their life. And so I think that it's a very multi-layered thing. It's a little bit like Drag Race being put into the mainstream and more people dabbling in it. It's a good thing because it brings it to a more mainstream consciousness, but in taking it to the mainstream, it loses a lot of its context and nuance. You know, hashtag no nuance November.
Yeah.
you do lose the history, and it's like the people that think of Pride as a party rather than a protest, and it's because they're looking at it with a modern lens without any concept of the context and the historical importance of how we got to where we are. And it's like I was reading earlier about white feminists talking about like, oh, you get condoms for free, but why don't you get the pill or sanitary products or whatever, forgetting the context of Black queer people during the AIDS epidemic were the people that fought to get condoms more widely available for free.
Yeah.
And it's these historical contexts that just get
Swept,
erased completely by white people and cis het people, or whoever fits more happily into society's standards it's that kind of colonial mindset of we discovered this, we invented this, when inevitably we were actually the people that ostracized and destroyed people for this.
Yeah.
And now it's kind of the cultural appropriation thing of all of these gender norms and gender ideas that are so prevalent at the moment are Western ideas that we have forced onto other people, and now that we have squashed them all, we can take the bits that we like and pretend that we invented them.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's
and
the
so
problem.
there's so like it's a huge discussion.
Yeah,
so much more than a man in a dress.
Definitely.
And then there's people with conjecture about his sexuality, and that's almost not relevant because it's a magazine cover.
Yeah, I think as long as with that situation in particular, I think as long as Harry Styles isn't seen as the kind of pioneer of this,
which inevitably he will be.
Yeah,
to
unfortunately,
some people.
I know a lot of, I've got friends who have younger siblings who like absolutely love Harry Styles, and I don't think that they necessarily know, because I don't think it's the first time that he's kind of done that kind of boundary pushing photo shoot before, but I wouldn't put it past a lot of the people that think that's the best thing they've ever seen to not have then gone, all right, well, what has been done before to allow him to be able to do this without much scrutiny or backlash.
Yeah, and it's like, what else is this doing on a societal level? Like, people were saying, people kept calling it gender bending, and it's not. It's a man wearing a dress.
Yeah.
Like, it's not. Clothes don't actually have an inherent gender.
Mm-hmm.
That's not him coming out as like a trans woman or gender non-conforming or something. That's just someone wearing a different garment.
Yeah.
From any other culture, someone wearing something without leg holes could be man, woman, either, neither, both.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's just it's a piece of fabric, a beautiful piece of fabric designed by queer people.
Yeah.
Hand stitched, amazing stuff, but at the end of the day, still a piece of fabric.
Yeah.
And that's not doing an awful lot to actually actively challenge the societal norms that victimize and marginalize people every day. But people will tout it as some massive, great step forward for the community, which in regards to representation and, being the first masculine presenting person to be on the cover of Vogue, and that he chose to wear a dress. Sure, that is something, but it's not some huge fucking milestone that people might pretend that it was, unless I'm missing something, and I could well be. I'm not as informed on that world as I used to be, because it all gets a little bit depressing after a while. But I was huge into it when I was younger. It was a massive special interest of mine. I've got so many fashion magazines and knowledge in my head of a decade and a half's worth of high fashion catwalk looks.
I love that.
Taking up space in my brain rent free.
So we've talked a little bit about your kind of high fashion representation, and then I sort of mentioned earlier about Instagram and stuff, because I think in our world, when our sort of parents and grandparents were growing up, it was kind of magazines were where you were exposed to photography, billboards and etc. But I think for us, it's all Instagram or it's all social media mostly. And so I was going to basically bring up the point how when I first sort of got onto Instagram and everything, I was kind of and it was the kind of year, and I know it's not finished, it's not over this it's basically like Fitspo and clean eating and all this kind of stuff. It's not that it doesn't exist anymore, but it was, for some reason, I think with the rise of YouTube influencers in the kind of mid 2010s or early 2010s, it all got a bit difficult to ignore kind of people who are getting paid to be these kind of, you know, white, thin, fit, no problems in the world, everything's great, buy my shit people. That was a lot of what I was exposed to, I think, in my mid-teens, which is obviously kind of my fault because I had Instagram. It was, you know, it was my decision to get it and follow these people. However, nowadays and over the past few years, I've definitely kind of gone through who I'm following, taken off, and it's not like a personal slight against these people. It's more that I just know that it's damaging. I know that that it's kind of like nothing's actually real on Instagram. And it's kind of taking away all the people that make me feel shit about myself through no real fault of their own. But it's not, you know, it's kind of hickledy-pickledy. And then or following then and filling up that space that's missing with people that are different or celebrate their differences or are just, you know, a little bit more interesting. And like, not, it's difficult because I don't want to offend like another sort of group of people, but it's also like, yeah, I don't know.
Well, they're almost not people at that point, they are more businesses.
Yeah, definitely.
Because it's a marketing strategy for them as an influencer and the businesses that they work with. So I think there is a point where you have to realise that you are both a commodity and a consumer to these businesses. And so you have to exercise your rights as a consumer and not and just remove yourself from these places. And that's not anything on them. That's just you with your right to choose where you spend your money, where you spend your time, where you want to be the commodity that's being sold. Yeah,
that's it. So with the kind of things that I'm exposing myself to now in media are just kind of, you know, queer people who have similar body types to me, or not necessarily, but just people that aren't that kind of completely unattainable standard. And I think that in feeling a bit more represented by these people, it just makes me feel better about myself, you know. And that was it took me ages to realize that, you know, especially when I was growing up and I was kind of not really sure about my sexuality. I mean, I was sure, but I felt a lot of like guilt about basically everything because I went to Catholic school. You know, it was really difficult to find a space where I did feel like safe and I wasn't exposing myself daily to just like things that are causing me mental harm and stress, you know. And I think a lot of that, the kind of people who dominate or did dominate photography or photojournalism have a lot to like say for themselves in terms of just basically making every kind of slightly different group of people feel like utter crap.
Yeah, and I think it does fall at the feet of marketing and advertising companies, but I would say that's probably more symptomatic of society as a whole. Because if you look at, so for instance, the Sainsbury's Christmas advert this year that featured a black family that caused total outrage.
Yeah.
It is in business's best interests to not rock the boat.
Yeah.
And, you know, it was like when the Gillette advert came out about like the best a man can be and about how, you know, we need to be stopping with the toxic masculinity and raising our sons to be better people and not perpetuating these harmful stereotypes and ideas about masculinity. And then there was a load of backlash against it, with men feeling like they were being threatened, and I think the phrase is woke washing. And virtue signalling. This gets levelled at a lot of high profile either businesses or individuals. And so it's kind of in business's best interest to toe the line with what they think the majority is. Unfortunately, in some instances, the tide is turning against these other people. And so Sainsbury's did do a Christmas advert with a black family. And so like things are changing. And the thing is that is what British society looks like. So it's not making some kind of massive great statement. That is what societies look like. What our society looks like. And so the advertisers and the marketing people that showed these aspirational, beautiful people that were all slim and toned and blonde and all of that kind of stuff were kind of just symptoms of something, but then they exacerbated the whole issue. And multiple generations have grown up thinking that that's the only way to be beautiful and the only way to be worth anything.
I remember actually when I was in college, I was studying media, and we had to look at, I don't know if I've mentioned this on the podcast, but I think we've had a discussion about it with each other, and that old magazine called Jackie. I don't know if you remember that, but and just all the kind of, and I didn't really ever ask my mum or my grandmother like what them growing up as a teenager would have been like, but reading these magazine covers where it's all just like, how to make a man love you, 3 tips on not to be so bloody ugly, and it's just like, no wonder these things get passed down generationally.
I mean, Cosmo was still like that up until like a couple of years ago, until they realised that people weren't putting up with it anymore. Top 10 ways to give a blowjob, and all about like cis male pleasure, and about women being kind of a facilitator for sex rather than an active, enthusiastic participant, and all of these sorts of
things. I would
things.
definitely say, although it's not really tying in with this topic, but I will just say as a side note that like when I was growing up, before I'd even had sex, I had the idea of sex that I was just kind of, you're the kind of plaything. Does that make sense? It took me ages to understand that like it was like me having pleasure wasn't just from me giving it to myself when I'm like masturbating, basically.
Yeah, or that your pleasure isn't somehow to do with the pleasure of the other person.
Exactly.
So like when you get people that, I saw this on Tinder translators the other day, but when cishet men will really pride themselves in like kind of, I love going down on a woman, I love like my tongue doing blah. And it's just like, you're going to do some sort of like weird performative thing. You want the person that you're with to do some kind of song and dance about like, oh, how great it is that you're actually paying attention. But it won't actually be about the person with the vulva's pleasure. It'll be about, you look how great I am, feeling like the good guy, have a gold star, have a cookie kind of moment. It's a whole thing.
That's a whole
you're so
thing.
Not alone in that. It's the vast majority of people still today.
Yeah, but I do think that it's
grim.
What is to blame is how, because I never really had like a discussion with my mum about sex, which I'm kind of, I don't feel like that was something I missed out on. I didn't get sex education in my school, so I was literally just like nicking my sister's Cosmo magazines and going like, shit, what, like
that is not the way to
healthy.
Learn. It really isn't.
No, if I ever have kids, we will be having a workshop. But anyway.
Here's your first vibe.
Yeah, literally.
Just go have some fun with that.
Yeah.
And then we'll
Merry Christmas.
Talk afterwards.
Yeah, so I guess before we can probably jump into our interview with Phoebe pretty soon, which will be great. We can probably do that now, actually. I was going to make another point, but it immediately shot out of my head. So if it's a good point to jump over there. So just a quick introduction for Phoebe. So she's been both of our friends for like a few years. She's been my friend since I was about 4 years old. She was actually the first friend that I made in school, which was we still remember it to this day. in reception. Good times, good times. So Phoebe has a degree in arts history from UCL, which is University College London, I'm pretty sure. And she recently completed a master's in art history as well, specialising in feminism and queer theory. So obviously, as soon as she was back home and as soon as I could see her after lockdown, we had a quick chat about her coming onto the podcast, and it all fell into place. And she's going to chat to us about who she studied for her master's, which was a queer photographer called Catherine Opie, who we both had like a pretty small understanding about before. I'm talking about the interview retrospectively because we did do it yesterday, which we have mentioned, but we're going to play it as if we haven't done it yet. It's all going to be very, very streamlined. So let's go and call Phoebe.
What? Why? Why does it have to be like that? We did it yesterday. Hi, we're here in the past interviewing our wonderful friend Phoebe. Phoebe, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello. My name is Phoebe. I've just spent 4 years at UCL. So I did my BA in art history and I did my MA in art history as well. I've specialised in modern and contemporary art with a specific focus on feminist art and women's art, but also recently in my master's, queer representation and queer theory in art as well. Yeah, so that's me.
Oh, that's so cool. Wow.
It's very fun. I mean, it's stressful, and the whole master's just felt like a roller coaster on fire, but also very fun.
Nice.
But yeah, so I had written an essay previously on Catherine Opie, one of her portraits, which it's 1994. It's a self-portrait. It's also called Pervert, which is an image of how I'll describe it for anyone who's just listening on audio. But it's basically the artist topless in a leather bondage hood with the words pervert cut into her chest. And it's an incredibly powerful image that I was kind of immediately drawn to in a lecture, and was just like, I had that kind of instinctual, like, I have to write about this kind of reaction to it. And it plays a lot with the word pervert and how it is used derogatorily. And particularly in relationship as well to the BDSM community, which Opie is a part of. And just the representation of a butch lesbian woman in that situation for me was so intriguing, because I'd never really seen an image like that before. Particularly in an art history lesson. You know, we had seen modern and contemporary, but, you know, for your first couple of years, you're definitely taught the Western canon, which is, you know, Renaissance paintings and you know, things like that. So it's obviously it's a big change. She does look at Renaissance paintings and kind of old masters paintings, and there's definitely an influence, but it's obviously a very different kind of subject matter and approach. For my masters, I kind of went to a Barbican exhibition called Masculinities, which was on kind of the beginning of this year. I think it's moved now. And one of her first series was in this, and I just had to write about it. Maybe I should give a bit of an intro about her. Would that be...
definitely.
If you'd like to,
I read her Wikipedia page, but that is basically as far as I got. So
I mean,
go ahead.
she's still, you know, she's a contemporary artist. She's still practicing. So there's lots about her, which is really good. And she does loads of interviews, and loads of them are accessible online. So she's definitely a very accessible artist, you know, to kind of explore.
I'll make sure to link some of those in like the description of this episode and stuff.
Yeah, she's just incredible. I could geek out all day. So she was born in 1961. She had her first camera when she was 9, I think it was, and she'd made her first darkroom by like her mid-teens. I think she was like 14 or something. So she was like invested in photography since she was really young, and she was influenced by the kind of canonical photographers of America, like Lewis Hine, and the kind of documentary photography practices that were going on with, like, I think it's Farm Security Administration. It's a whole kind of American documentary history.
Yeah.
She went to uni and studied photography there, and I think she even did a master's. She moves to California, I think for the degree, but I'm not quite sure. And she starts to get involved in this community of the LGBTQIA+, but particularly the butch lesbian community and the BDSM community that's in San Francisco. And
so whenabouts was this?
So this is like the late 80s, early 90s.
Mhm.
I think it's kind of the early 90s. She makes the series Being and Having, which is what I wrote my dissertation on and is kind of considered one of her first big series, in 1991. So that kind of era, we've still got the kind of AIDS crisis happening. We obviously have, I think the attack of Rodney King is due, if not happening at this point. We're kind of negotiating the residues of what some people would call like second wave feminism. So it's this, if we look at it kind of intersectionally, it's a really interesting moment to think about American society and identity with race and sexual identity and gender.
Yeah.
And from there, she's kind of grown. So her first kind of series are about the queer community, really, and what it means to be part of a community, and how photography, through its practice and also its subject matter, can create community and invite and celebrate and welcome. But the way that I kind of see her whole body of work, if you can kind of conceptualize a whole body of work, is to try and capture not necessarily Western, but American society and sensibility and identity in kind of all its complexities and paradoxes and intricacies. You know, the queer community, but she also goes and takes photographs of high school footballers and thinks about that kind of mainstream masculinity and the institutions that kind of indoctrinate that in America, and also the patriotism of American, you know, football. She looks at the kind of immigration of the mini malls, in which many people who run those mini malls are immigrants that are, you know, working towards that American dream. Mm-hmm. She does surfers, and she's thinking about that culture. So she's definitely a really interesting photographer to think about a kind of form of social commentary and a bit of critique as well.
Yeah. And do you think that, would you say that her artwork was particularly striking at the time? Like, it was kind of weird and people normal mainstream people didn't really understand it, and that's how she kind of came to the light, would you say?
Yeah, so it's quite an interesting, it's a brilliant question, because her work, she always kind of jokes in her interviews that her work's never really been censored, and some of it is quite graphic and some of it is quite explicit, but the only piece of work that she's ever had censored was basically these women just said, like, you've taken our photograph without our consent and we don't want it in an exhibition, so take it down. Her work's definitely shocking, and I think even now it's still shocking, but it's never had the censorship that people like Andy Warhol or like Robert Mapplethorpe or, you know, those kind of artists had at the time. You know, like Mapplethorpe had a massive censorship in the 90s and the 80s, where people just wouldn't show his work, and there were these absolute kind of almost riots and protests that his work was being shown in a very conservative America. His work is a lot of BDSM and quite explicit sexual imagery. Obviously, Andy Warhol did a series, I think, in 1964, which was meant to be shown at a World Fair, and it was of criminal mugshots that were all screen printed and shown on this big side of a wall. And that one day was just covered over with aluminium paint, and nobody really knows why or who did it. But they completely censored the work with this, for fear of a homoerotic undertone, because these men were looking at each other and looking at themselves, and the criminal was a very kind of sexualized masculine trope in American cinema at that point. So, you know, at the time, American conservatism was really censoring these artists.
Because usually we would have more, or male artists would generally have more leeway. But could this be indicative of kind of the erasure of like lesbians as part of the LGBTQIA plus community, and sort of the idea that mainstream media or just mainstream society hasn't necessarily had the issues with lesbians that they have with gay men because they almost don't believe that they exist?
Yeah.
Would you say that that's how she managed to fly under the radar?
I think that's completely on the point. Absolutely. It is definitely that question of like, and this happens a lot in art history where you're taught about, it doesn't happen as much now. It's more kind of, if you look at old texts and things, if any artist was identified as lesbian and was in a relationship, a lot of the time they were just very close friends, and they lived together, and they shared a bed, but they were best friends. And it's like it's a running joke along a lot of my friends that this is historically not everywhere, and particularly not really now, but there are cases where that is how lesbianism, particularly in the arts, is kind of just been completely brushed over. And I really think that is how Opie's work wasn't censored, because, as you say, the gay community, and particularly the gay male community, was considered a lot more scandalous, and definitely had that taboo where lesbianism just didn't have that. It was very much erased and wasn't taken seriously, and was just very much patronized, perhaps. I think
absolutely.
It gave her a great opportunity to then create platforms for her work to be seen, but she definitely acknowledges that there's, for some reason, her work was never censored, and while that's fabulous, there's obviously something going on there.
I saw a meme the other day, actually. It was a Renaissance painting of two women lying naked in a bed together, and the caption just said, like, two best friends hanging out in their friendship bed.
Well, I think we talked about that in episode 4 about pronouns, and about how even just the two of us have kind of flown under the radar in a lot of situations because people just forget that lesbianism exists. Yeah. And so you look back on very, very successful people, like in literature and in art, obviously, and you go back and it's like they were very, like, financially successful. They had loads of like material wealth, but they shared a bed, and you'll see reports being written as if it was kind of, they just had to, because they were like artists, and so artists, they lived in like a 1-room apartment, and so they shared a bed. That's just like, no, there were other bedrooms. That was a choice. That wasn't like through fiscal responsibility. That was their life. But you would be forgiven for completely assuming that it was due to some kind of financial constraint on them from the way that these stories are written about.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting, because I think that's an issue that a lot of gay women and femme presenting people, particularly, I know it's an issue with very femme, like bisexual women, of that the inner issues around the erasure. And obviously within erasure there comes an element of safety, because you're not necessarily at the height of the risk to your personal self, but then your emotional self gets damaged by the fact that there's these assumptions that are put on you all of the time. And so the fact that her work wasn't censored, and in a lot of cases with art that has been censored, that has been where maybe a male artist would have risen to meteoric fame because their work has been censored, and so that's put them on the map of like, they must have done something really scandalous, which makes the other part of the population go, ooh, what was it? I want to see it.
Definitely.
So her flying completely under the radar and not being censored meant that her art never necessarily rose to those meteoric moments of your Andy Warhols and stuff. And it is that double-edged sword of the erasure and the more passive censorship of like, we won't actively censor it, we won't paint over it in black, but we'll kind of just pretend you're not there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And her career is definitely been more of a snowball effect. It's building that momentum, and now she even teaches at, I want to say, UCLA, or it's a big art uni institution, and she's actually a she's on the head of the board or something for the Andy Warhol Foundation and things, so they're all really interconnected. It's a really interesting dialogue. But yeah, she didn't have that like sudden spike because of the scandal. And yeah, as you say, it is very much a gift and a hindrance in representation, and also just your career as an artist.
The whole thing about censorship, it's definitely a shame when people in the LGBTQIA plus community get censored, because oftentimes their artwork comes from more of an organic, sometimes painful, but like a very relatable place for a lot of people, and it is a shame that they aren't quite as easily found or accessible.
Kind of linking back to that pronouns podcast that you guys did previously, what I liked so much about this was they are butch lesbians. They identify as women, although some of them are trans men. And it's not only the representation of the BDSM and the butch lesbian community, it's an embrace of alternative masculinities, which go beyond the biologically sexed, that go beyond even the kind of, what I would say is in America, the kind of ideal masculinity. It's a really interesting piece to think about masculinities that don't fit into that, and the beauty of those, the dignity of these. She works a lot with old masters, like Hans Holbein the Younger and Franz Hals and people like this, who painted men in their portraits, obviously looking very regal and dignified and in control and powerful. And she's using those motifs in that language, and she's creating that environment and that status, that dignity for people that have been, as we've discussed, censored and erased and oppressed and marginalized. And I mean, this is such a significant piece of work for the history of queer representation beyond just sexuality.
Yeah, and that's something that I think we have talked about it before on the podcast, but it's something that we both feel quite strongly about, is that, so when the podcast was in its infancy, a mutual friend of ours explained it to somebody without ever having heard it or anything, and he was just like, oh yeah, it's just about birds fucking. Which, wow. Unfortunately for him, if he has listened to any of it, this is woefully lacking. We barely mentioned scissoring at all. But one of the things that I noticed about her work is, obviously there are the BDSM themes, but in queering these traditional archetypes of kind of master and man and these ideals, particularly in that kind of glossy American dream nuclear family type thing, in queering those, she humanizes and dignifies, and all of these words that you don't often get around narratives about queer people. And in that, I don't mean queer narratives, but I mean external viewpoints. It's always about sex. It gets sleazy and stuff, and sex is an important part of life for the vast majority of adults, but we are more than that, and that, I think, is something that comes across so profoundly in her work, particularly when there's partnerships and stuff, is kind of the beauty in kind of the mundane.
Yeah, absolutely.
And like the normalcy of, like, there's this one in particular that I really love, which is Melissa and Duke Durham, North Carolina. It's just a really beautiful image. Like, the color palette's there, but there's nothing graphic. There's nothing, but it's a beautiful queer image. that has fuck all to do with sex. And I love that, you know, even though you're completely right, some of her work is really graphic, like with the scarification, and, you know, there are these butch lesbians as their masculine counterparts, they are like topless or whatever, but there's nothing vulgar about them, there's nothing sleazy, it's just giving people the power that they should have always been allowed.
I think it's really nice as well for people to see queer relationships represented in such a way where, you know, there's this whole thing about how some people don't think that they count necessarily as part of the community if they haven't had sexual relationships with, you know, same sex or things like that. And I think it's, like you were saying, I mean, it's just really nice to see the relationships represented in a way that doesn't really count, doesn't really have anything to do with sex.
No, I mean, I completely agree. You know, it's unremarkable. And I think that's, for me, was something that I found, actually titled my dissertation after the unremarkable, but also how remarkable these bodies are. Because, yeah, as you say, it is such an important aspect of queer representation or LGBTQIA plus representation that is very often missing. And I think it's what happens when you actually allow artists from that community to depict their own community.
Absolutely.
Instead of having an outsider coming in, when you have that lateral relation of the group and the community and the mutuality of that, I think this is what happens. So it's kind of like a championing of actually showing these works and funding these artists and exhibiting them in galleries and you know, letting their work speak for itself instead of having someone else try and speak for the community.
Yeah,
absolutely, because it's about the gaze as well, isn't it? And that's, by gaze I mean GAZE rather than us beautiful lot, but about who's looking through the camera. Because then if you think about the lack of particularly lesbian and queer women representation in the vast majority of media, with the exception of porn, the lesbian quote unquote porn is these beautifully polished, long-haired, hairless, long-nailed, kind of glamorous women who I'm in no position to make any estimations about their sexuality, but they absolutely do not represent the entire spectrum that is lesbian women. You know, kind of, they will occasionally make a nod and they'll have like one person with a short haircut that can be the one wearing the strap on, but that's kind of as much diversity as you get. Whereas if you actually put someone from the community behind the camera, they can show you the intricacies and the breadth of a community that contains humans and therefore contains multitudes.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Phoebe, for...
No, thank you so much.
I've learned so much, and I think it's going to be really good for the listeners to find out more as well. And, you know, if we can find some, because obviously she's still working, as you say, but if we can find some more, like, you know, more contemporary versions of Catherine Opie doing the good work of just kind of no particular lens, just real representation, which is what we definitely need more of. We will link you, lovely listeners, to that.
Wasn't that lovely?
Yes, that was great.
Phoebe was so interesting and eloquent and had so many great points. It was really hard to cut it down to just 23 minutes.
Yeah, we've got, I think, a more uncut and longer version available for our Patreon subscribers. So
if you want to listen to the full hour of us yammering on.
Yeah. I'm really gutted though, because we had like a really hilarious conversation about chickens like just after the interview, and I had stopped recording by that point. But it was
it Claire
brilliant.
Baldwin?
Yeah, Claire Baldwin. I can't remember
her
the other
rage.
names. Yeah. Claire Baldwin was a chicken that Phoebe had with PTSD and unfortunately had to return to the woman that gave her this chicken, but she still has two. But anyway, yeah, that was a really good interview. I felt like I learned so much. And what a fun, probably stressful, but what a fun topic to study for a year. Like, I just think that is so interesting, and it's so cool that Phoebe chose to to learn about that and also share it with you guys. And I hope you've all learnt something from that as well.
Question of the week, yeah.
I guess that's that. What is the question of the week?
Oh gosh.
I do know what it is.
Do you?
Yeah, it was to do with photography. So it's, if you had an infinite budget, what would your dream photo shoot be where you're the star model? You're like the face of it, you know?
Do you have an answer since you knew the question? Because I forgot.
I do. And it's a little bit like, so basically with these questions, I kind of go with the first thought that comes into my head because, you know, I could have many dream photo shoots. I'm a Leo and I'm a bit of a narcissist. So I would say, you know, I think I am. I mean, I would love to be.
Is a pathological term. And
Okay.
people really need to stop overusing it.
Okay, I'm not okay. Right, I'm a Leo, and I would love for someone to just come up to me and go, "Hey, here's £1 million. Do you want to do loads of photo shoots?" Which then I would probably get framed and have all over my room. So do with that information, make your own assumptions about that. But
There's a small bit of vanity, perhaps, and that's about it. Maybe.
Oh yeah. So mine. So basically, journey back to 2007. There is a music video by Ashlee Simpson called Out of My Head, if anyone's familiar. I remember when it came out, I was obsessed with it. And I feel like no one else knew what it was. Like, no, it wasn't really talked about much. And all the comments on the YouTube video, because I went on to kind of refresh my brain, they were like, you know, this song didn't pop off enough, like near enough as it should have. And I was like, agreed. But basically, there's a part of the music video where Ashlee Simpson is sat. So, right, I'm going to do my best to describe it for people who are listening. But imagine, right, mountainous backdrop, and like sort of desert flooring. There's like a therapist's office with like a chaise lounge and like a lamp. Pan upwards, there is a giant floating Rubik's Cube, which she sat on. And then there's like a gold melting clock and like a gargoyle's head that's been like a giant gargoyle's head on the floor. So it's all very kind of like Salvador Dali-esque and just a bit weird. But as soon as I thought, what would my dream photo shoot be? That just came into my head. And I don't think I've thought about that song or that music video for many, many years. But basically, and she's kind of wearing like a steampunk outfit, but I don't know what outfit I would wear. But I just really want to be, I just want that, basically. I want to be on a giant floating Rubik's Cube.
See, my goal for that question when I wrote it originally was that we would try and do the photo shoots, but on a really, really low budget.
We absolutely
and you
could.
have ruined that idea.
No, I don't think I have
no
actually.
idea how we're going to do
that.
that.
I think I'm already thinking we'll paint a cardboard
Unless we
box.
do it all in post.
Yeah.
We can just draw
exactly.
the gargoyle. draw the gargoyle on. We'll just green screen the whole thing.
Yeah, or we'll just get really small versions of everything, take really like high resolution photos and then just blow them up. But we could paint a cardboard box to look like a Rubik's Cube. Yeah, we can just crop me and put me up in the air. I think that's very achievable, actually. If we put our heads together.
Yeah, no, we can. We'll give it our best shot.
Yeah, keep an eye out for that. But yeah, what about you? Have you got any? What does your?
Well, that's the thing. Like, because I have. I always sound like such a prick. Well, I always feel like I sound like such a prick when I talk about this, but I have done some modelling.
No, you're beautiful.
Because I'm naming
Embrace it.
And I was once asked to do a photo shoot because of my queer identity, which, in hindsight, should have been a red flag at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And I hadn't really come out yet. Certainly not as non-binary or gender fluid or agender or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know how it had happened. But yeah, anyway, so this photographer knew. I didn't know her very well, and so she asked me to do. She wanted me in a suit, but wearing like makeup and heels in a flower field or something, and then like the next one like in a dress, wearing DMs and like with slick backed hair,
so
in
kind of
some
like
kind of like industrial
50-50,
space.
I'm using air quotes again, kind of esque.
You know, super original.
Yeah.
Super original. Oh, this person doesn't really have a gender. This is a really, really original concept.
Mm-hmm.
And quite frankly, she was a bit of an arse about it because I wasn't super keen on using my identity as a. I mean, here I am on 2 Queers, 1 Pod, for fuck's sake.
But no, it
But
was
at least
more.
this is
It was
my own project.
and
For someone else's
and that woman.
gain, it felt a bit
That woman
weird.
wasn't. Yeah, she was straight to our knowledge or to your knowledge, because I do remember this happening. So it's that kind of like, you felt like it was kind of like a glorification rather than
Yeah. Or it was just kind of a weird fetishization moment. So I wouldn't do that, or I would, but it would be with us, and we'd do it better.
We are going to do actually that James Bond poster one. I think about it every single day. I'm not going to give
I just
it
want to
away.
do Charlie's Angels, but it's all me.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
If it has to just
can
be
make that
me,
happen.
then I want to do the full Charlie's Angels with the fire and the outfits, but all 3 of them are me.
I'm like, quick tangent, because it's definitely worth saying. Charlie's Angels is one of the best films ever.
I'm so glad I showed you that film. I can't believe you hadn't seen it.
Wait. What do you?
Oh, was it Lana that hadn't?
It was Lana. I have been watching it since I was tiny, and I think Drew Barrymore was also part of my sexual awakening. No, it was Lana that hadn't seen it.
Lucy Liu.
Oh,
Jesus
but
Christ.
that scene at the start where they're all being introduced, like, I really want to recreate that, or just the whole film. If we ever get super famous and loads of money, I want us to redo that film just for ourselves. Oh my god, amazing! You got me all excited now. But yeah. Well, that 20 minutes was utter shit, so we will cut that out. And you'll never know. But anyway.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed our first interview. It's the first of hopefully a fair few with some lovely other queer babies.
Yes, and I haven't checked with Phoebe whether or not she's comfortable with us giving out her like links and where to find her and stuff. So I will ask her, and we'll pop it in the description of this episode, or not. But yes, thank you so much, Phoebe, and thank you everyone for listening. You can find us on Instagram at 2Queers1Pod, or Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Acast, or wherever you prefer to do your listenage. Again, at
We're also on
2Queers1Pod.
Patreon for
Yes.
for these visual pods, so that you can watch our Zoom conversations, because we're still in lockdown, and other fun bonus features of photos and videos and just cute little tidbits.
Yeah.
But we've currently got a deal running until the end of the year, where if you sign up to the visual pods, you get a free postcard from both of us.
I'm pretty
with
sure,
one
and
of our
that's the
illustrations.
£1.50 subscription, right?
For £3.
£3, excuse me. £3. For 3 tiny English pounds, you can get all of that great stuff. But yeah, I need to burp. No, I'm good. Right. Thank you very much.
I love you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Right.
This podcast was produced by Harry Williams.